I am joined by two very special guests. I appreciate their time to begin with, and you're going to appreciate their level of expertise as we reflect on some of the findings that we'll be publishing in our 2023 Sensitive Content Communications Privacy and Compliance Report. It will be released on July 11th. Those of you who have joined today's webinar will get a sneak peek. We'll be sending it out sometime next week, so watch for that in your incoming email. It's a 40-plus page report, so we obviously in today's webinar will not be touching on all the subjects contained within it. We've cherry-picked some highlights that we think are most salient for members of our audience, and we'll be doing a drill down into some of those findings and looking at takeaways based on the experience that Ty as well as Andreas has in the space. If you have any issues with today's webinar as we're displaying the slides, just chat a question to Eric and he'll be able to help you. If you have questions about Kiteworks, so you can chat those in as well, and Eric's online and he can assist you. If we are not able to answer your question during the webinar, we'll take a note and we'll get back to you. One of our experts will after the webinar is completed. We're really excited about the conversation today. As I noted, this is the second year that we've had the Sensitive Content Communications Report. And the highlights contained in today's webinar, I think you're going to find quite interesting. I am very fortunate to be joined by two expert panelists. Ty Lambo, he is the founder over at HISPE. He's also the co-founder of eFortresses, as well as Andreas Wuchner, who is the cyber risk advisor and investor. He's been at a plethora of different companies, just as Ty has, in various cybersecurity roles, CTO roles, compliance and risk roles, and so forth. Before we jump into the details of today's webinar, I would like each of them to introduce themselves. So Ty, let's start with you. You're based in Atlanta. Tell our audience a bit about HISPE, how they can find out more information on HISPE, and how eFortresses is intertwined with some of the things that you do with HISPE.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for the opportunity to be a panelist again. Thanks for inviting me back. So yeah, HISPE has been around about the program itself about 18 years. So HISPE stands for Holistic Information Security Practitioner Institute. Tried to solve the security and compliance problem, siloed approach to security and compliance, and that's really what we're still doing.
Oh, thanks, Ty. Andreas.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for having me, Andreas Wuchner. I had the pleasure to do this already last year, right? So repeating this. My word, I'm an angel investor and a partner at a VC firm called TempoCap in London. So my day world is investing into cybersecurity organizations, but my background is 26 years of cybersecurity, doing jobs around security for companies like Novartis, Deutsche Bank, UBS, Credit Suisse, and HP. And since around 16 years, I'm doing this kind of angel investment stuff, where I help startup companies to really get the stuff right, to prevent mistakes, which others have done before, and things like that. So therefore, that's my life, and I'm very happy and thrilled to be here and to discuss with you the newest report.
That's great. I appreciate you guys' time. Anyone who doubted me about your subject matter expertise in this area now no longer are doubters, needless to say. You guys bring a lot to the table here, and it's going to be a lively discussion. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to review, what we did with the report, the types of questions, how many questions, who did we survey, those type of things. So I'll briefly touch on that. And then we'll dive into the narrative of findings. And we really see a narrative here, if you may, that ends up landing in the digital rights management arena. If you've been reading some of the stuff that Kiteworks has published over the last 6 months or so, you'll see that we believe that the market's headed in that direction. We'll include some survey data near the end of today's webinar that bolsters that case. But as a starting point, we'll look at the fact that there's a complex web of a bunch of tools that are in use to send and share and receive sensitive content communications. And then there's a lot of stuff that's being shared with third parties outside of your organizations. It's hard enough to control that sensitive information as it's sent and shared within an organization. But then when you open it up to those third parties, it exponentially increases the risk. We'll talk about gaps in security maturity. We'll look at the multiplication of compliance requirements that are happening in the marketplace. We're seeing fines go up and penalties. Organizations need to spend a lot more money on lawyers and legal implications. We'll cover how you can demonstrate that you actually are compliant with a lot of the data regulations out there in the marketplace. And we'll look at a few of those that we queried our audience about in the survey. We'll look at how cyber threats are ratcheting up risks specifically related to sensitive content communications. We'll talk a bit about the DRM issue that I just brought up a moment ago and how we believe that it's due over time. Look at a couple of key takeaways. We like to speak in threes, so we'll finish it up with those three key takeaways. Then we'll open up for some Q&A if we have time at the end of today's webinar. You can chat in your questions through the chat function in the Goldcast platform, which all of you should have up in front of you. So why do we do this report? We started this report last year, and the objective is to provide sensitive content communications, privacy, and compliance peer benchmarks and trends to folks like yourselves, to IT leaders, security leaders, risk and compliance professionals on an annual basis. See how those things change. They obviously aren't all going to stay the same, and we do include some analysis of how survey respondents answered questions last year, as well as how they answered them this year. So it's interesting to see those comparisons. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we staying the same? And so forth. Survey methodology, we ended up surveying 781 professionals in the IT, security, risk, and compliance arenas around the world. You can see the headquarters of the companies, a nice distribution there. Obviously, because of our operations, we focused a lot on US, but we do a lot in Europe and the Middle East and Asia as well. And we have a significant representation from those regions. The job responsibilities, we broke up into three main taxonomies: IT, security, risk, and compliance. You can see how everything broke down there, and then the various job titles that were associated with each of those. Survey methodology continued in regards to organization size. We didn't look at organizations under 1,000 because they have some distinct challenges. We queried organizations with more than 1,000 employees. You can see there's a wide distribution from that standpoint. And then industry segments, we actually expanded our survey this year, and we added some industry segments that we didn't have last year. And you can see federal government is a big component, which wasn't included, as well as legal in last year's survey. So it's interesting to have those bits and pieces. So let's jump into some of the findings, and we'll get our experts going here. You can stop listening to me. As I noted, the survey found that there's a complex web of tools being used, as well as recipients. We'll do a little build here. 83% rely on 5+ communication tools, and there's probably some shadow tools, I bet, in the environments they don't even know about. Half use 6+ tools. This creates a lot of complexity. You can see the comparison of 2022 to 2023. The numbers went up there. We did adjust the findings or the potential answers a little bit, which led to some of the differences here. But overall, we see that the number of tools that are being used to send and share and receive sensitive content is increasing, which adds a lot of complexity. It makes it more difficult to demonstrate compliance with all the regulations in the marketplace at the same time. Now, when we look at how many folks outside of your organizations this sensitive content is being sent to, the numbers went up here as well. 90% exchange sensitive content with 1,000 or more third-party organizations. 44% said they exchange it with more than 2,500 third parties. And you can see the comparison 2022 to 2023. Let's start on the tools front. Andreas, I noted this issue of shadow. Do we really know how many communication tools are in use today at various organizations, different sizes and so forth? And does this concept of shadow IT, which all of us have talked about for more than a decade, apply on this front?
Good question. I think shadow IT is one of the major areas of change in the last 10, 15 years in IT, right? Before we called shadow IT the servers somewhere in a room, somewhere in the world, or under the desk of someone who did a project, who were deaf forever, and somehow deaf became prod, and they just ran there, and they were all out of control in one way or the other. Nowadays, with the cloud enablement and with all the possibilities of third parties, that whole method has shifted, and servers or service capabilities are now coming from everywhere around the world, right? And the only thing which has really not changed around that tool thing is that problem of asset management, right? Most of the organizations are struggling to figure out or to name really precisely how many assets are out there. And the surprising part for me there is mostly, it's not the lack of data, it's the lack of consolidated information, right? On one side, we do vulnerability management, we scan the stuff, we have assets asset information coming from clients on the workstation, clients on the server. By overlaying all this data, we would most probably find out much more about our asset reality, right? But we're not doing this really because we have much more, or many more problems, lower hanging fruits we go after, right? So shadow IT has changed. This is for sure shadow IT, and asset management or asset DB quality is still the major concern and still the major problem underlying this. And I don't think that I go out too far by saying that the vast majority of organizations have no clue about the real extent of assets really in use around their computing power.
Yeah, I figured that was the case. Is people get their jobs done and they go around processes. We have one question which I don't think we talk about in today's deck, but it's in the report that talks about email encryption and what do recipients do when they receive, as well as the senders when something's received that was encrypted, but they don't support that encryption standard. And there's a bunch of workarounds, most of which aren't secure. They increase risk exponentially. Andreas, on the supply chain or third-party organizations, do we really know how many third parties we communicate with? Probably more than we realize. And how do they create risk? We've heard a lot of stuff about the supply chain risk. We've seen a lot about supply chain risk actually come to fruition. How do we measure this and how do we manage it?
I would be careful with the assumption that just because we have higher numbers, the risks are getting higher, right? Because we are living currently in a cycle of economic downturns, right? And a lot of companies need to look and need to find alternative ways how to do IT. And that's why the numbers go up. Digitalization helps, so the numbers go up. The question really, or the deciding factor in my eyes, is really about the criticality of the data and the services, right? And how much critical data do we share? And if we share, and that's a little bit of the indication which we see later on, if we share more critical data with more people outside, then the likelihood that we miss something, and with that, the risks of downtimes, failures, and things like that definitely goes up. But just based on the pure number of things, I would be careful with this assumption. You remember I was twice responsible for third-party vendor risk in organizations, right? And we always had around 4,000 applications, right? And, this is in the meantime a pretty normal situation for enterprise companies. But, now with the regulation changing, with the allowance to do more on the cloud and things, that the criticality went up, right? The data criticality. And with that, the need. So therefore, I guess, if you look in budget plans, or if you talk with CIOs or board members these days, everyone has the topic around third-party vendor risk on the agenda. Gartner talks about it, Forrester talks about it, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is we share more critical data, and we need to definitely care more about what's going on there, what's out there, and get more of a grip really around the whole risk management. But again, given that we are struggling sometimes to do our internal risks, third-party risk is far more complex, right? And we don't even talk about fourth and fifth-party risks, right? So this is still a growth area and a focus area for the next years to come, in my eyes.
Yeah, I agree, and maybe there's the glass half full. The fact that organizations this year recognized a higher number of third parties, maybe that's a reflection of maturity, if we want to look at it from that perspective. All right, let's jump into gaps in security maturity. We have another slide build here. You can see here, we ask a question around, rate how well your organization does in measuring security risk for sensitive content communications. And we ask the same question now: how are they doing from a management perspective? And the numbers are relatively the same. They seem to struggle a little bit more on the management front than measuring. But everything but the green means that they have some challenges, maybe significant challenges. And it shows we have a long way to go on that front. Now, when we look at the right-hand side, this is an interesting perspective as well. We ask a question around, how satisfied are you when it comes to risk management of your third-party content communications? It goes back to the slide we were just looking at and some of Andreas's points. 10% said, and it varies across industries. Some industries it's twice as high, and in other instances it's twice low. It's not as much as the 10% reported here. But 10% said we need a whole new approach. What we're doing now is completely broken. It doesn't work. We need a do-over. And then 32%, so this adds up to 42% when you add the two areas together, said that they significant improvement is needed when it comes to the systems and policies that they have in place here. Andreas, let's start with you. What are some of the ways organizations can measure security risk when it comes to sensitive content communications? And does that same methodology apply when it comes to management, or do you need to have two completely separate systems in place here?
I guess what the numbers clearly show is that the model hope from the past comes to an end, right? So hope that every third party does a good job, hope that the software I'm using is safe, hope that the third parties which produced my software take care that the open source libraries I'm using, they're all good and nice. That's clearly why so many people say, look, we need significant or some improvements at least, because it just doesn't work this way. The approach, if you look at it just from a little bit of a higher point of view, the approach is a relatively simple one, right? You need only three things really to understand third-party risk and what you need to know. You need to know and understand what you share, really. What do you share with third parties? That's a very, very important thing. And that's where it already starts to become problematic often, right? What do we share with whom? The second thing is really protect the communication channels appropriately, right? Again, if you have whatever VPN connections or still use plain text FTP, I'm always amazed how often you still see these things. You just cry for someone figuring it out, right, and finding it. And third is really monitoring your vendors, right? And now you make the differentiation between monitoring and manage, and I think this is very, very a very valid point. Monitoring. There are so many tools, service providers out there, and which helping you at least to get the basics right. And we are used to monitor third parties for financial things, for changes in management, all that stuff. That kind of technology stack can be used to monitor. But the manage thing is much more a process question than a tool question, right? A lot of tools are offering to manage certain risk elements. But, to have the culture internally that everyone says, oh yeah, that's important. I follow the rules. I'm not buying services through my credit card, and I have ways to really figure out if something goes wrong. That's a very different thing. So monitoring, a lot of tools, questions around there, make it right, get the oversight. I talked about asset management. Management is a process and a culture problem where we really need to address the human side and make it nice and easy for the people to adhere to processes, and then we will get better. But as I said, I think that will keep us busy for at least for the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, and the human element, Andreas, is a great point that you bring up. If many in our audience probably read the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that came out, I guess it was earlier this month, about 3 weeks ago. And I believe it was 83% of all attacks are the result of human error, that humans were involved somehow. So it's no surprise that is going to percolate and come to the top of the mix when it comes to measuring and managing your risk. Ty, on the right-hand side, I'm interested in your perspective because you talk to such a large number of cybersecurity and compliance professionals in the marketplace. 42% say, we need a full do-over or we need significant improvement. Why do you think that's the case?
Thanks. I hope my connection is good now.
Yeah, so far.
You guys, awesome. Okay. I think I'm seeing a shift. I think 10, maybe 15 years ago, I think a lot of organizations followed the money when it came to third-party risk management. So if we're paying a supplier, if I'm a CISO for, let's say, a major service provider for the banking industry, which is what I was doing about 15 years ago, we'll follow okay, if we're paying them, then we want to provide some oversight over, how they handle our data. What I've seen change in the past 10, 15 years, especially in the past 5 years, is it's no longer following the money, it's following the data. Because your users could be using a free service, but they could be putting stuff, sensitive data or sensitive content in that free service. So I think that goes back again to Andreas's point about asset management, really knowing the value of your asset. And your asset could be information asset, could be physical asset, could be services, could be people, could be the intangible assets as well. And being able to provide protections that are commensurate with the value of the asset, the business value, I have to say, not the value that the sysadmin or the IT guy or gal, assigns to the asset, but the business owners, the people who are most connected with the business process or the business function that asset serves. So I would say I've seen a shift from, risk management programs, certainly, third-party secure, sensitive content communications, focusing not just on the money, for in terms of areas of risk they need to focus on, but focusing on the data that is being exchanged. So I'm not surprised by the 42% that say they need a do-over, because I actually think if you were to survey maybe smaller businesses, it'll probably be like 100%, because some of those businesses have nothing, right? They're at zero, right? But for organizations 1,000 employee plus, 42% sounds reasonable.
Yeah. Well, we do have it's not in our deck today, but when you get the full report from an audience perspective, we do have a few questions that we ask this year around data classification, to Andreas's point, and now your point, Ty. And I think there's some interesting revelations there. Actually shows that most organizations are doing some level of data classification. They at the same time reveal that they still have a distance to go. As I noted, there's a lot of things that fell out of today's webinar just because there's only so much time that we can spend covering all the different topics. But those are great insights from both of you. Thank you. So the next slide I almost took out, but I included it because I thought it was very interesting, because many of the communication tools that are used in the marketplace today are hosted in the cloud. Not all of them. Some of them are on premise. And we do ask questions around on-premise versus cloud, and you'll find that information in the fuller report when we release it in another week or two. But from a multi-tenancy standpoint, a lot of these tools run in multi-tenant environments, and there are risks that exist when you're running and using a SaaS tool or an IaaS tool or whatever that sets in the cloud in a multi-tenant environment. And you can see the answers that we got here, which were quite interesting, where they said, yes, bad actors can easily, 48% of them, almost half, can acquire a cloud instance of an application, set up a sandbox environment, and identify vulnerabilities that can then be exploited in the instance you're using. Next one, bad actors can exploit one application or data set, move laterally and gain access to applications or data for other tenants. 31% answered that item. 19% said, yes, bad actors can instigate a DOS, a denial of service attack on a multi-tenant hosting. We've seen some of that this past week. We saw the news from Microsoft on their environment that was hit by some DDoS attacks on one tenant that impacts other tenants in the shared infrastructure. Hey, Andreas, just quickly, because you have an interesting perspective here, I suspect when you were head of risk and compliance at a couple different companies, did multi-tenancy factor into consideration when you were vetting technology solutions?
No, not to be totally honest, no. And when we started, we were really thinking, okay, third party is a huge problem, right? And fourth and fifth party, really, let's focus first on what we can do and what we can control. And I think you see a good indicator that things like GDPR and some other regulations only came in the next iteration about fourth and fifth party, right? So I think this is a development which is still very modern or actual. Clearly, it has to be considered, but as Ty just said, people which have legitimate access to things, they have legitimate access independently where they are. If they are with me, if there was a third party, fourth party, fifth party. So there's a reason why we did the separation of management and monitoring, right? There are the monitoring capabilities. We just need to make sure wherever independently the people are coming from, we have a grasp what is normal and why is this kind of behavior analytics such a big thing these days? Exactly for that reason, right? And the combination there, it's good, right? There are more means, there are more technical means. You can do much more. And I think I agree with you with a solution like the Kiteworks solution. You can do so much more than what you can do without. It's the combination. And really, I would be lying if I would say, no, that was on top of our mind. No, it was, we learned about it by going up the ladder and having more look into stuff. And, on purpose, I mentioned at the beginning quickly when you do your own software stuff and you use open source libraries and all that stuff, we are far away, miles and light years away to have control over all these things, right? Mm-hmm. And, so therefore, again, this is something which stays with us. I'm pretty sure all three of us can retire in this subject area. It will not be solved by then.
Well, Ty referenced all the folks who started off in his program who are now retired. So he's starting the trend. Well, that was security. Let's switch over to, compliance requirements. We had some interesting findings on this front, very similar to what we saw on the security front, maybe a little bit higher actually, where, it's difficult to, achieve maturity when you're looking at it through a compliance lens. It's a whack-a-mole issue, as Andreas, you just mentioned. You've seen a maturation, evolution in the space when it comes to compliance. There's a lot more regulations on the books. Here in the U.S., we have this example of California started it with the CCPA, but now we have Virginia and Connecticut and Utah and Colorado and Indiana. I can't even remember all the ones on the list now that have passed them, and they will be implemented. I think 4 of them this year and some more over the next couple of years. And there's another 10 laws, I think, that are being legislated right now that might be signed later this summer. So, there's a lot happening. We ask, the U.S.-based organizations, do you have a plan in place? How are you prepared for these? And maybe because California has been in place for a while, many of them said, yeah, we do have a process that's codified. It's working, a little more than half, but 47% or so, 46, 47% said either we haven't started, and these are US based companies, and they have over 1,000 employees. So they likely are running operations across states, or they say we're working on a plan. So there seems to be, some need for improvement. And certainly this is an area I would think that organizations, if they're based in the US or they conduct operations here, they got to be focused on. Compliance fines are going up. I found this stat very interesting in regards to GDPR. In 2023, thus far, the fines in 5 months are higher than the aggregation of the fines in 2019, 20, and 21. So that's substantial. And as they put more and more teeth in the compliance regulations, organizations need to focus more. And then data sovereignty. This is actually not in our report, but I threw it in because I think it's relevant. Next year, we'll put in a data sovereignty question. Only 65% of organizations in a Thales research study that was published earlier this month said they are very confident or have complete knowledge of the location of their data. That's substantial when you think about it. Andreas, and we're going to jump to the next slide here in a second, but can you reflect a bit on, because you've been in a number of roles of risk and compliance. Is it getting easier? Is it getting harder? It seems based on this slide that it's getting increasingly more difficult if you are charged with compliance within an organization.
There are currently, to my knowledge, 41 countries around the world which have a data sovereignty law. Switzerland, where I'm living, is one of them, right? And this is a new factor, right? Wasn't there so much 2 years ago, so that gives a new flavor. One of the fundamental problems is still there and it's not solved, that a lot of these regulations are conflicting. What is okay here is not okay in the US or vice versa. So you're constantly fighting a battle as responsible, which fine to pay, because you cannot heal the world. You cannot go straight and go right at the same time, right? These are things which are just not doable. I know the regulators are putting a lot of efforts into prevent that and to overcome it, but at the moment there's still a lot of conflicting stuff out there. But the good thing is technology gets much, much better, right? So therefore, give an example. In the past, we asked roughly 500 of critical service providers for their policies, right? To check, are they NIST compliant, yes or no? And we had an army full of people reading them, going through them. We lately introduced an AI language model, which we trained on that. So in 2 minutes, we know if a policy is NIST compliant, yes or no, and which parts are not, right? So there are things which are getting better. The use of technology makes things a little easier. The better understanding of controls, control thresholds, and control gaps as a result of that becomes easier to measure, but not to manage, right? So knowledge is there, but again, I made at the beginning this differentiation between data and information. There are a lot of data points, not necessarily the information, the whole forest there, because again, there are so many silos. And if you just see, I have the pleasure to talk quite frequently with board members of organizations. And one of the concerns, besides the lack of resources or the lack of talents in the security and risk space, is just that they spend so much time on manual efforts, right? Because everyone has a notification law. Yes, thanks God, you're a global company and you have 120 countries where 60 of them have notification law. Good luck with that one, right? This is impossible to do in time. And that's the kind of complexity and time consuming, which consumes a lot of time and costs, right? So there's a lot to do still, but I'm very positive that we are going in the right direction here.
Interesting. And the AI component, I completely agree with you. It's having a exponential impact across departments, industries, and so forth. And that's an interesting use case that you just cited, which is a perfect segue to this slide. That how organizations doing when it comes to demonstrating compliance or adherence with those regulations in the marketplace. they spend some time on it. And this is just related to compliance, adherence associated with sensitive content communications. It's not related to other compliance issues. It's just related to the space that we're talking about today. So 69% say they spend 300 plus staff hours on this issue. 36% say they spend 500 plus hours. 49% say they have a dedicated headcount. 42% say they have 2 FTEs just when it comes to sensitive content communications. And then we have here a overlay on the right-hand side when we look at industry sectors. The most hours that are spent are in pharma, life sciences, financial services, and state government was tied. State government being there is kind of interesting. I'll pose a question to the panelist on that. And the least hours is local government. Ty spent some time in local government. I think you'll have a unique perspective there. And then legal law firms. Andreas, let's stick with you on this one. Needing to demonstrate compliance it can suck a bunch of energy, resources, and time. Why is that the case? And specifically, why is that the case when it comes to sensitive content communications?
Let's start from the back, right? If you look at most hours, that means highest cost in pharma, life science, and financial services. If you look at where the huge fines are coming from, that's exactly these 3 sectors, right? They are the payers of the fines. And so therefore, there it's the likelihood, if you're a life science company, that you get pulled over and say, hey, this wrong, it's just super high, because that's where the regulations are mostly clear and enforced, and the regulators have muscle power and methods in place to really gain money, right? You see, if you look especially at the GDPR law, there are so many smaller companies which got, notice and there is a violation, but they don't get really fined, because that could significantly impact their ability to survive, right? So that's the gap right there. The problem is really just, again, you mentioned it before, too many tools, too many solutions, too many approaches, not enough of information really on what and where and how. So I think also Ty mentioned before about consolidation. The companies will be required to gain back control over this. So I'm indirectly saying we lost control over that, because if you see 500 plus hours, this is just ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
We talk about the shortage of resources. We spend so much hours on things which is not value adding, right? We don't sell anything more. We don't have anything better. We don't get cost leadership. We get no operation excellence, no innovation. We don't reduce risk. It's just a burden, and it's good, right? Because we get better from it, but it cannot be with such a high cost ticket to it. So, and as Ty said before, consolidation and reduction of cost is the key to success here. Otherwise, this will just go more and more and more crazy. As you said, 10 more regulations in work as we speak, right? So if we don't find platforms which allow us to do this in a straightforward model, I think we sooner or later have to give up and say, look, white flag.
The fines are easier to pay than the actual compliance, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Ty, just on the local government standpoint, are you surprised that they're down at the bottom, having spent some time in local government in your career?
I would be disingenuous, and I would be lying if I said I'm surprised. No surprises there. Patrick, if you advance to the next part of the slide, there's some numbers about FTEs.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
That one is probably more telling. So if you look at fewest FTEs, I think it's a resource challenge, with local government. So several months ago, I was hired as the first CISO for a major city in the US, one of the fastest growing cities that also happens to have the world's busiest airport, 100 million passengers a year. So I was responsible for not only City Hall, but, a water treatment or water agency, but 40 plus agencies, including the world's busiest airport. And I had one direct report when I signed up for the job, just one. for the entire city. Right. And so that was like taking us from zero to something. And I mean, even if I had all the best, even if my direct report worked 24/7, there's no way they'll be able to get to sensitive content communications as something. So, the 500 plus hours, 300, I'm lucky if I get them spend an hour looking at this, right? So I think and that just tells you, it kind of paints the picture of the challenge with local government. Local governments, which most of us, probably live in a city, we live in a town, maybe we live in a village. Those are our local government, right? So I happened to work for, at the time, again, several months ago, for a local government that was a city and one of the fastest growing cities in the US. And it wasn't on our, I mean, like DLP, data loss prevention, was on our radar. We knew we were bleeding data, but when it comes to like sensitive content and communications, it just wasn't on the radar. We had bigger problems, and some of the bigger problems we had were technical debt. So we had systems that were end of life 5+ years, and I used to walk around saying it's a miracle that they would truck through them. They have that many vulnerabilities. So this is not a surprise at all, and it's very indicative of how resource constrained most local government as well as state government when it comes to like cybersecurity in general. I always tell people, if you drive through any town or any city, you're going to see potholes. For every dollar the city spends on patching potholes, it's at the expense of $1 they're going to spend on patching systems or replacing systems, right? And it costs more than $1 to patch a system, right? If you think about the soft cost, you think about maybe the software cost of maintaining licenses and making sure you've got the latest and the greatest. It costs way more than $1. So these dollars are constantly competing, and typically the elected official, like the mayor, would say, hey, their manifesto is usually, I'm not going to increase taxes, right? Very few people get elected when they say, I'm going to increase taxes, because people don't want to pay more taxes, right? They want to pay less. So that's always a challenge. How do you do more with less? And how do you make sure that you prioritize your security, your dollars? Does security take a back burner, or does it, compete against fixing potholes? So no major surprises there, but I just wanted to use that as an example.
That's a great analogy, and yeah, local government is difficult when you're in the security, compliance, risk, and compliance space for sure. I'm not going to have each of you talk to these because I want to make sure we spend some time on DRM here at the end of the webinar. But this slide has some interesting findings in terms of the fact that rogue nation states, and a lot of it's happening through rogue nation states now. It's going up more and more every year. We hear about it in the news, it seems like daily, as well as organized cyber criminal gangs are targeting content. And we ask our survey participants, did you have an exploit in the past year? And most of them said yes. And a large number said we had quite a few, as you can see here, based on this slide and the pie chart on the left-hand side. And then we ask them, what were some of the implications when an exploit took place? And 62% of them said we had financial implications as a result of an exploit that happened in regard to our sensitive content communications. 43.5% said we had brand impact. 42% said we had compliance penalties and fines. And I think this isn't included in the report, but we found that the financial implications, cost, legal, compliance, and so forth, when you add them all up, depending on the person in the organization, they may not be aware of all of them. They may only be aware of the ones that are specific to their role and responsibility. So they may be higher in terms of the percentages that we have here on the chart than actually was reported. Hey, I want to spend a little on digital rights management and the fact that we believe that a do-over is necessitated. We ask a number of different questions in regards to DRM. You'll want to check out the full report for all of them, but I put a few on this slide. I'll go ahead and do the full build so you can see what all of them look like. But 22% said they track and record third-party access to all departments and content types. That means that almost 8 out of 10 don't for all of them. That's a significant risk. Only 25% restrict access to sensitive content folders and files. Only 22% track and control access at the admin level for both on-premise tools as well as those that are in the cloud. As I mentioned, we did ask this question in regards to on-premise versus cloud, and there's some interesting findings you'll find in the report. But, and then you see on the right-hand side, those that are most mature from an industry standpoint, those that are least mature. Ty, when it comes to tracking and controlling access, where is the weakest link? We're seeing this perhaps on this slide on the left-hand side, but is it users, departments, content classification, all the above? What is it?
To sum it up, all of the above. But we keep blaming the users. In most cases, we keep pointing the finger at them. But I think most users will want to do the right thing if you make it easy, if you keep it simple, stupid, right? Make it so easy for them that it's harder to do the wrong thing, which means you have to find products that are like Kiteworks that are simplified, right? If I need a PhD to do secure content communications, then to use a secure content communications tool, then it's not the right tool. It should be so easy that anyone will be able to use it. So keep it simple, stupid. So it's not just the user's fault, but I think it's also maybe the IT department's fault that they've created this complexity. In some cases, the data classification, going back to what Andres mentioned a few slides ago, your asset management needs to tie in with your data classification program, right? So if you make your data classification program so complicated, then it's not going to be easy for the users to actually follow it. So keep it simple, stupid. But don't just blame it on the users. Make it easy for them.
Yeah, that's a great
or at
point.
least easier.
Yeah. Andreas, when we look at the left-hand side of the slide, it seems that some industries are doing better than others. Is this pass the sniff test in your opinion? Is this reality today?
Yeah. I think as Ty just said, the problem is whenever you bolt on security, and DRM was for many, many years bolt on, right? It was never user friendly. It was never built in, and people were always creative by finding ways around it. And it just becomes better. It becomes easier. And with that, I think that we move into the right direction. That's the reason why I agree with a do-over time. That is a clear thing. One other aspect here is the usage and enablement of cloud services, right? Cloud providers and cloud as a SaaS services just offer so much more built in. And here, I guess, we have an opportunity to enable and embed all these new features and capabilities into our solutions and then make it user-friendly. The problem is, even if still a lot of CISOs and people are afraid about the cloud, but most cloud providers offer far more security than the in-house organizations, right? But they still don't use it to the extent, and they miss the trick in using it as an opportunity and rather focus on, oh my God, I'm losing my little garden here, I'm losing control and things like that. In my eyes, there is a huge opportunity for the industry and also for all the security professionals to embrace these new capabilities and these integrated tools there to become better as an organization. And a good CISO can easily live with a good security solution coming from someone else.
I fully agree. Well, that's a good segue to our last slide here. As I said, we like to talk in threes. And, we met as a group and we looked at the data and we came up with, well, what are our key takeaways? And these are the three that we sort of consolidated around. One was, take a DRM approach. As we noted on the slide we just looked at, institute content-defined zero trust. So that's what we like to call it here at Kiteworks, to track and control sensitive content access per user, security standards, compliance regulations, geography, etc., both in terms at the individual user, at the admin level, based on NIST standards, which is one of the other elements here. From a security standpoint, Andreas, you just spoke about it. What does that look like when you're vetting vendors? You're looking at tools that you use to send sensitive content. What are some of the things that our audience members should look for here?
For an holistic end-to-end view, right? When you look at third-party vendor risk, if you look at these kind of solutions, often you see that they are very narrow and that it only looks at a very specific type. And I totally agree that it depends on the service you're looking at and its scope, what you want. But at the end, if you don't understand it end to end and what the user, what data, what services, dependencies, and all that stuff, we will always fall short. And so therefore, I would rather go with 80% of depth, but with a full breadth, right? Rather than saying, oh, we have 80% of the scope and that's deep, but we missed 20%, which are very important. And so therefore, know what you're looking for, be flexible in your approach, and then I think you're in a pretty good situation.
No, those are good suggestions. Ty, just one last point here. You came up with this concept of beyond compliance. Talk a bit about what that means.
What I'd like to see is a little bit more harmonization between NIST and the ISO standards. We're kind of close to that point where they're kind of saying the same thing, but they need to start using similar taxonomy. From what I hear, I think ISO is actually open. The ISO committee and the working groups are open to kind of adopting the NIST CSF approach. The concept of functions, categories, subcategories. Recently, I had the opportunity to look at the NIST AI risk management framework. It uses exactly the same approach as the NIST cybersecurity framework. So, I always say, if your compliance program was driving your program, it's like your dog. It's like the tail of your dog wagging your dog. The dog should be wagging the tail. The dog is security. The tail is compliance. So it shouldn't be the other way around, right?
Ty, Andreas, we're going to have to do this again next year with the 2024 report.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. For other Kiteworks webinars, make sure to check us out on kiteworks.com. And if you'd like to take a test drive of Kiteworks, make sure to request a demo. Click the button at the top right-hand corner of the website. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.